So then in 2010, I get inducted into the North Idaho College Hall of Fame. And I told the story of how I got there. And I'm like, well, here's the truth. I lied to get here, but I fulfilled the obligation that was given to me. And this is how I did it. This like misunderstanding that became the catalyst to probably one of the most unusual lives I could have ever imagined.
I've never had a Hall of Famer on my podcast. What's it like to be a Hall of Famer? Is it the North Idaho Athletics Hall of Fame?
It is, and that's.
Are you impressed?
I'm actually really impressed. Getting into North Idaho College in particular kind of is like where it all started for me in the U.S. And it started for me in the U.S., but it started for me in the human performance sector as well. So getting into North Idaho College, as I told Bert Soren one time, was the best lie I ever told. Because what ended up happening with that situation is, grew up in southern British Columbia, played some sports in high school, but I was not a recruitable athlete by U.S. Division I standards. So I didn't know what to do with athletics, let's call it that, at that point in my life. So I graduated high school. I had the equivalent of a couple silver medals at the state meet, right? That's what it would have been like. I went to the provincials and was like silver in shot discus and hammer, right? Yeah. It was fine. Wouldn't blow your skirt up, but it was fine. I was very athletic, obviously. To have no coach and to do that coming from a logging town in British Columbia to go out and compete against.
What town?
So Golden. So it would be Kicking Horse Resorts there now. Golden was your classic mining, logging, railroad town.
Okay.
So it'd be Whitefish.
Yeah.
50 years ago, Whitefish and Golden are almost identical in their demographic. And they're almost identical now in how they've changed.
Yeah.
Kicking Horse is it's not probably, it's a much larger, more invested in ski resort. The towns themselves are very similar. Mm-hmm. The people that are still there that were there when I graduated high school, struggling a little bit with that transition.
Yeah.
Unless they own a coffee shop, restaurant, or you name it, right? But it's also a Trans-Canada town, so it's also the route from east to west, west to east in Canada. The Highway 1 goes through there. So we always had transient traffic. So the restaurants up there, they did fine. So that's where I started, and I didn't actually live in that town. So I don't know what to relate it to, but I grew up in a town 18, 19 miles south of Golden. So the town I grew up in was a stop on the railroad where they would load cars for the logging industry. So my dad was a superintendent for a logging company, and we lived in that town. Elementary school went, kindergarten through grade 7, and I believe there was about 30 of us, that went to that elementary school. It was small.
Yeah.
And then once you hit 8th grade, they bust you into Golden.
Yeah.
Right. So
makes sense.
Yeah. Right.
A lot of that goes on in Montana still.
It's very similar, right? Like you drive up the 93, hit the 95, and you just keep going straight. You drive right through where I grew up. So for me, when I look at this area, geographically, it's all the same. Mm-hmm. The elk that I used to see coming down the Columbia Valley are the same elk that people are hunting in northern Montana. Yeah. Right. They don't have, passports type, So when I came out of that system, I grew up racing motocross, skiing, because skiing was huge there, both heli skiing, backcountry skiing, and then eventually commercialized resort skiing. So that was the world I came from, dabble in some slalom skiing in the summer. And so when I finished up that high school, I was like, what am I going to do? Right? Like I had no idea. I wanted to continue with the sports, but there was no avenue for me based on, I didn't have an SAT. I didn't have school counselors that understood athletics. Athletics in Canada, unless you were from Vancouver, Calgary, et cetera, or had a hockey stick in your hand, no one knew or had some sort of connection to sport that could foresee a career out of it.
Yeah.
I didn't speak French. I was what we referred to as Queen's English, right? Or Queen's Canada, meaning which, I was like, I don't need French, So I struggled through it in high school, never retained it. So they're like, oh, that's a check mark against you already. You're not going to get into university. I had all that against me.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, what am I going to do? So the year after high school, moved down to Trail, British Columbia, which is kind of a border town to Washington State. And they had a reputation of having some good athletic clubs, right? Mm-hmm. So Canada, it's pretty common to have some sort of extracurricular club that you send your kids to for track or for baseball or for hockey. And they will kind of fill in the role of what is highly developed high school sports here.
Yeah.
Right. So the club system in Canada back then in particular was pretty decent in certain towns. So I went to this club 1 year after high school. I'm training. I have no idea why I'm training. Like, you know, you're dreaming about, maybe in track and field, it's always the Olympics or a national team, like some such lofty thing. So I'm training there, and what was typical of those clubs is there was a older athlete, been on a couple Commonwealth teams. I think he had been 3 national teams at that point, the decathlon, Greg Turner. And he goes to me, man, you should consider going to the U.S. I'm like, oh, I don't got an SAT. How am I going to go to the U.S. and play sports? I mean, it was always a dream, but it's an impossible ask. And he goes, junior college. I'm like, wow, what's this magic, right, that you speak of? And he goes, it's a 2-year school in the U.S. You won't need an SAT to get in. They do have athletics, and they do give scholarships if you need it. And if you're good enough at the 2-year level in the junior college system, they will recruit you out of there for Division I.
Right.
I'm like, well, what do you have to do to get recruited? Because you just got to get your associates. It overrides the SAT. And so I was like, okay, that's actually interesting. So still had no clue what to do. He went to Spokane Community, so that was his familiarity before he went to Washington State. I don't think he ever got his degree, but he was there. And when I looked at it, I'm like, well, I don't got the internet, which is crazy to think now, right? So this is late 90s.
Yep. What year did you graduate?
So I graduated high school in 95.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, you know, this would have been 96, you know, training at this track club, trying to figure out life. I went to a library and I pulled up a book, and and it's funny because I told this whole story at my Hall of Fame acceptance. Is I pulled out this book and I just started flipping through it, and it was I remember it being a green covered book in a Canadian library, and it was 2-year colleges of the United States. So I obviously looked up Spokane Community because he had referenced it. But I also just looked geographically to where my parents were living at that point. And my dad had been transferred within the logging company to Creston, which is right on the border.
Yeah.
And so 100 miles south of that is Coeur d'Alene, Idaho.
Yeah.
And so those were my 2 that I knew for sure, because I'd been to Coeur d'Alene at least once in my life and been to Spokane. So I called Spokane Community first. No one answered.
Yeah.
No big deal. So then I got on the phone, called Coeur d'Alene, called North Idaho, and Mike Bundy, who was the head track coach at the time, answered. He was also historian, history teacher / English. Not a guy that spent a lot of time in the office. Like he really never was around. But oddly enough, he answered the phone that day. And he had no connection to the track program outside of distance running. But I told him, and the lie that I told was kind of a simple one at the time because I didn't know what to say. On the phone, it's almost like an instant interview. And he goes, well, what do you do? And I'm like, I throw the hammer, disc, and shot. And he's like, well, how far have you thrown? And that's where I was like, oh, I have no idea. Because the implement from high school to open men goes from 12 pounds to 16 pounds, just like the shot put, right? So the only mark I had was a high school 12-pound hammer throw mark, which was like 167 feet-ish. And so I just tell him that. I'm like, 167 feet without thinking. And he goes, oh, my God, that's better than anyone we got right now, because I hadn't converted 16-pound in my head. I wasn't even thinking that. I was just answering my best PR.
Yeah.
And he goes, you should come down and meet our throws coach. And I was like, okay. So I tell my dad, I'm like, I think we got a unofficial visit to North Idaho coming up.
Yeah.
And we did. So we went down, and the throws coach is Bud Rasmussen, who became one of my most important mentors in my life, and Bart Templeman, who owns the Ironwood Throws camp out in Idaho now in Hayden. They, what was interesting is at the time, Bart, jovial as can be. Bart will always be Bart. You know, he played for the Broncos when they were expansion team. But Bud was really like, who is this guy that the distance coach is like dropping off for this visit? Like, you could tell he was like, really?
Yeah.
Like, he's not on our radar. So I met them. We had a good lunch. Everything went fine. we're driving back to the school with Bundy, you know, because he was our official chaperone, like, hey, look who I brought you. And he goes, so do you want to come down? And I'm like, sure, send me the paperwork, right? So like they sent the paperwork up. And I said to my dad, I'm like, I think I'm going to the U.S. on a scholarship.
Yeah.
You know, it was ridiculous. And he's
they
like,
didn't have you throw or anything?
nothing.
They just took your word.
Took my word for it. So my dad's like, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I want to go. You know, it's like, it's better than going to Calgary to like Sade or Mount Royal, like where I thought perhaps I might actually go play volleyball. And they were considering me at Mount Royal at the time. Because even though I was an undersized volleyball player, I could jump extremely high. And I played volleyball almost my whole life. And so I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go in the fall. Now, granted, between the time I signed my letter of intent to the fall that I arrived, I had surgery on my foot because I shattered it in training one day, right? So like there were some weird things in there that happened that I was like, oh, you know, I hope this doesn't derail my dream.
Yeah.
So I get there in the fall, and I'm as green as an athlete could be. I'm from a town of 100 people in rural British Columbia where we didn't have policing, fire, or ambulance, right?
Yeah.
You know, Clayton Johnson was the gunsmith and the post office, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, a claim to fame or someone of celebrity that would look up to is Clayton, when he was like 65 years old, you know, dropped a moose at 600 yards with a 6.5 by 55, right? Like, so you're like, those are the people you're right. Kind of like used to looking up to, you know. Short, odd story about Clayton Johnson, you know, rest in peace at almost 100 years of age. He, used to work in a mine in the town I lived in. And he told us as a kid, his job as a teenager is he would sit with his legs apart in a mine and hold like a 2-inch metal pipe. And he would hold it between his legs, you know, so it was up above his head.
Yeah.
And guys would take turns hitting the pipe with a sledgehammer.
Oh my God.
And every like 3 or 4, this was his job as a teenager. Every 3 or 4 hits, he would give it a crank into the ground and take a teaspoon and take the dirt out of the top. It's how they used to stick dynamite when they were working in the mines when he was a teenager. He did that for years.
Damn.
So even in his 70s, he had these massive hands and forearms.
Yeah.
Had all of his teeth in his 90s, had his hair, you know, just this big, powerful Swedish guy. And that was, you know, so those were like the people that were just kind of satelliting your life when you're growing up, right?
Yeah.
You just thought it was normal, right?
Yeah.
Loggers and miners. And so anyway, tangent. So I get down to my freshman year at NIC, and I'm just like, I'm overwhelmed. And it's funny because you look back on all the steps and progressions that you made as an athlete all the way to working in the NFL for me. But when I look back at that was so overwhelming in comparison because it was the first step, right?
Right.
There was a lot happening, you know. I didn't do great my first semester in academics, you know, all that sort of stuff that just hit me like in the face. But the one thing I could control, and I knew I had control over, knowing full well that I was now aware of the fact that I'd given them the wrong distance to get in, is the fact that if I just went to work every single day and I never missed a day and I listened to everything that they told me, and I just, no matter how hard it was, I was just going to absolutely, you know, bleed myself in their training system. And I'll get to why this worked in a second, that I would probably have success. What I didn't realize, well, I had put this mentality into place, is that Bud Rasmussen, who was a little bit hesitant to have me come into his program because he was a young coach and he's like, man, distance guy, right? Throws me this thrower, he's probably going to suck. Bud Rasmussen, who was starting his collegiate coaching career at the time, would go on to be the 2008 U.S. Olympic coach.
Oh, wow.
Right? So I didn't realize that me coming in with this, I'm just going to grind and push and overcome mentality because I feel like I owe these guys the truth.
Yeah. Paired with what was going to be amazing coaching.
Amazing coaching. Had no clue, right? Mm-hmm. And what ended up happening is I came in as this like completely empty vessel, right? That this guy could pour his knowledge into and his training methodology, and we'll see what happens. And so what ended up happening was exactly what you would hope to happen in that scenario. Won a national title that spring in the men's hammer throw, first ever national title they'd ever had at the university. And then I went on, or junior college at the time, and then I went on to have 2 more national titles. And what that did is, because it's a 2-year college, to win 3 national titles in 2 years put me as the most winningest national champion in school history.
Yeah.
And so that opened up a lot of doors.
Yeah.
It opened up scholarship offers. At the time, University of Wyoming had the best up-and-coming throws program, so that's inevitably where I ended up. But, you know, all those years later, you know, so then in 2010, I get inducted into the North Idaho College Hall of Fame, and I told the story of how I got there.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, here's the truth. I lied to get here, but I fulfilled the obligation that was given to me, and this is how I did it.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I walked them through it in the acceptance speech, and it was the first time I'd really spoke about it, because it was like this like misunderstanding that became the catalyst to probably one of the most unusual lives I could have ever imagined.
Mm-hmm.
You know, go from white lie misunderstanding, getting a scholarship, you know, to 20 years later, through human performance, you know, I'm in a villa in the palace of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia as they rocket us from Yemen. And I'm just like, I didn't see these dots connecting.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it doesn't make any sense that any of this happened.
Yeah.
But it really goes back to saying yes to that initial, like, holy shit situation, and really saying yes and then diving in.
Yeah.
And knowing that no matter what happens, it's going to be better or different. Sometimes they're not the same thing, than where I was probably going up to that point. Right.
Yeah.
Anything could have been better than nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So at least I was given some direction,
Right.
Or an opportunity for direction.
And there's luck involved in that, obviously. Luck that coach happened to be there and starting his career when he was. It's a similar story and outcome with, you know, when I was a Little League baseball player and my coach happens to make knives, right? And he's an outfitter, right? And I'm an 11-year-old and just into knives, right? And anybody at that time could have taught me to make knives, but he was in the beginning of his knife-making career, and little did any of us know that him and a bunch of the mentors that I had around Montana, that group ended up becoming world-class knife makers 15, 20 years later. Right. And so the people I was chasing, because I was trying to become as good as they were, right? And I was trying to make knives as good as they were, but I was failing to ever catch them because they were progressing at an amazing rate as well. Right. And they progressed into this, incredible talent and ability that they had, and they still are that way today. That was that luck that I just happened to find him. Also, then was paired with hard work, right? Like, I dove into it.
Yes.
Right. So, like, you can get lucky, but you also have to capitalize on it and put the work in to turn that luck into anything good.
Anything tangible, for sure. And I think because I saw, obviously my story didn't end at North Idaho College. So it wasn't always this curve that just went straight up because of that.
Right.
And I try to explain that to people. It's like opportunities will continuously present themselves for the most part. Mm-hmm. It's not an endless supply, and I think that's where I've learned that over time. So when you do have that really unique situation, you have to capitalize, mm-hmm. because it may be a long time before another opportunity of equivalent value.
But what you didn't know then, I didn't know then, and most people don't, is you don't know it's a unique opportunity.
No, typically
right?
not.
Like, you didn't know standing there as a dumb kid that you were actually in a super unique opportunity.
So unique that I've been hard pressed to see it replicated.
Yeah.
It did open the door for a lot of others to fall into that same unique opportunity, mm-hmm.
Meaning
which, and I think this is important for people to be aware of too, and why I found it very important very, very early on that you can't never stunt the idea of opportunity of those coming behind you. Like, it's very mm-hmm. easy when you had that success right away where you're like, oh, I must be special, right?
Right.
And, you know, F anybody else, I'm not going to help anyone. For some reason, either through the mentorship or my parents or where I was born, that humility kind of followed me my whole career, thankfully. So as soon as someone was like, well, how did you have success? I'm like, oh, you got to go train at North Idaho College.
Right.
Like these guys, like, holy crap, like Bud, greatest coach I've ever had in my life. Bart, change your life, right? So right away, I made that connection. Like those people were important. Yeah. So I didn't know why I was being successful because I was just like grinding it away every day and having fun. And I'm like, what do you mean you're not supposed to be here for 4 hours? Like, isn't that normal? Like, because I had no correlation to anything else in my life other than, man, you just got to work really hard and good things will happen.
And that's kind of my point is like, you don't know it's a unique opportunity when you're, you know, there are things that are going to happen today to someone and they're not going to realize that whatever's happening is an opportunity that will change their life. Yeah. If you take every opportunity of everything that you do and just work as hard as possible at it. And I always tell my kids, like, you know, if you go get a job doing something that's just supposed to be like fill-in work, right? Summer job, right? Just it's just money for school and for summer. If you work as hard as possible at that and you do your very best, like you have no idea what door might open. I've told my kids, like the guy that's paying you to do some landscaping might own some huge company and realize like, holy shit, this kid is like driven. This kid can speak well. This kid is like got some leadership or whatever it is. And at the end of the summer or 3 years later, when you're coming out of college with a degree, that guy might be like, I remember you, or hey, you should come work in my company. You don't know what. It's very rare that you something happens and you look at it and you go, this is an incredible opportunity. Like, and you recognize it in the moment. And a lot of times when you do that, months later or a year or two later, you're like, it wasn't as big opportunity as I thought. Like, for sure, it wasn't as real as I thought. It's the sneaky ones that get you. Yep. That you have no idea.
NIC was completely out of the blue. Wyoming was the blue chip opportunity of a lifetime, and it was an absolute disaster for me.
Really?
Yep. So, you know, it's funny because I didn't talk about Wyoming for a very long time. And in fact, I've only been back to the University of Wyoming once since I graduated in 2001. I went back a couple of years ago, and it was a little cathartic. Like, I'm glad I went back. Not going to go back again anytime soon.
What happened? What was the...
So when I was recruited into Wyoming, I was at that point, you know, having 3 national titles. You know, schools were looking at JUCO kids, especially throwing as far as I was throwing at that time. I mean, that's guaranteed NCAA points, right? So we just have to give this kid a full scholarship. He'll come in for sure. He'll be All-American, right? It makes sense. I mean, I would do the same as a Division I coach if I could get a good JUCO kid with their head on their shoulders.
Right.
So Wyoming had got a new head coach at the time, and it was his first head coaching job. Now, he was in our event area. So he's like, I got to have success right away. And, you know, we didn't know him from anywhere. We only knew his reputation as being successful, right? So as a throws coach at South Carolina, he'd been Bert's coach, right? So that opens up a whole nother chapter of life. But what it was is this guy had already produced All-Americans and national champions, and now he's a head coach. So, wow, he should really shine. And he did for a while. And so what ended up happening is he pulled in all these JUCO kids from all the kids I competed against at the national title. Now we were all teammates of Wyoming. Plus he brought in another, you know, group. But he wasn't a great coach at the time, right? He wasn't Bud Rasmussen. He had a reputation of winning, but what we didn't realize is he had been winning based on a standard of training that was non-sustainable over time. So he had a huge amount of injuries. None of us knew this, right? Yeah. So we come in with our same mentalities. We're a bunch of, now we're kind of like alphas, right? Because we've been successful. We're starting to figure out how to win. And now there's a group of us. And it was just like, training for us, even though we got along pretty well, you could see it was a constant steak feeding to a bunch of wolves, right? Yeah. So it was incredible what we achieved in a short amount of time. Strength levels, you know, the internet now dilutes everything, but you got to think, okay, take 19-year-old kids that are drug tested and have 3 of them training together that all were squat repping 600 pounds, right? And they're not weightlifters for the gram. These are kids going to school, training for 4 hours a day in another sport, and then going in and squeezing a workout in. And this was the type of performances that we were surrounded by. We had girls that cleaned 315 pounds in the late 90s, right? So this was happening around us. And so all you're doing is just pouring more fuel and more fuel. And with our personalities, you know, you're just like, well, I got to get to the top of the pile, top of the pile, top of the pile. I got to win. I got to be a champion. And it worked in my first year. You know, my first year at Wyoming, I was ranked #1 in the world. Like, it was an incredible sensation. Went to NCAAs, didn't have a great NCAAs, but that was more to do with some like external circumstances. Like, for some reason, I'd shattered a molar a year earlier, and it got really infected at my first NCAAs, and it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, whatever. But I was still ranked #1 in the world. My teammate, as odd as it was, we were ranked #1 in the world together because we actually had matching throws that year, which also is completely unheard of. So there was just a lot of weird stuff. So we go through that whole year, and I'm like, wow, okay, so if I was ranked #1 in the world but had a bad NCAAs, I'm going to come back in my second year at Wyoming, and we are just going to steamroll everybody, right? And so I went home that summer, and, you know, and not using like my previous methodology from guys like Bud and Bart, I use a new coach methodology, and this guy's got to be right because I'm throwing farther, not realizing it's just age and time that's been working in my favor at this point.
Yeah.
And I did everything he said to do. Gained a ton of body weight, did all this stuff, not good weight. I mean, I got strong, but I mean, I gained a lot of fat because he's like, throwers got to be big and fat. And I was not naturally meant to be that way. So what ends up happening, come back in to a
Slowed down,
got injured. So I came back in October, shattered my foot. Okay. So break my foot, have to have surgery. They put in a plate, whatever. End of October, I'm like, you know what? I'm still going to salvage my indoor track and field season. How bad could it be? And this is a testament to how much volume we'd done in training. So I was casted and booted for, man, it was like 6-7 weeks. Then I was on crutches and all that stuff. So at week 10, you know, so we're kind of over Christmas break, I guess, at that point. I'm out of the boot and I'm allowed to start training again. So, you know, do some workouts in the gym, do like one leg workout type of deal. Hadn't done much. Get back to Wyoming for the start of January's season, get medically cleared. So doctor's like, no, you're good to go. Like 4 days later, my coach had me at Kansas throwing, right? So I get on the bus, we go to Kansas, lo and behold, furthest throw in the NCAAs, right? So,
really?
So I'm ready to roll. Like in my head, I'm like, oh, that surgery was nothing, right? Whatever. Because our coach was a coach and not a mentor or a trainer or a human performance driven coach, he was just like, get those numbers on paper because that's what gets my bonus. That's what keeps my job. He never really thought about the fact that I hadn't had any rehab.
Yeah.
I hadn't done anything. I'd literally gone from booted, crutched, #1 in the country. Like that was my progression from a surgery.
Yeah.
Like it made no sense. But
You're a freak.
Yeah, I had aptitude, right? I didn't realize what God had given me. And when you poured fuel on that fire, it did the right stuff.
Yeah.
And that was just fact, right? So to put it in perspective, I blow up right in October, do that whole process. January, I trained for about 2 weeks because it was 2 weeks to a Tuesday after I'd been cleared, and like 12 weeks to the day that I got injured. I'm in the gym training with the guys, and typical stuff, you know, throwing steaks to wolves. One of the guys is like, hey, can you still jump pretty well off that plate in your foot? And I'm like, yeah, I think so. And he's like, hey, let's stack those boxes, right? So they stacked up like 5 45-inch boxes, like which sounds ridiculous. But for me, it was not easy to jump over a 45-inch box at that time in my life. Not onto a box and then down, right? Like just treat them like hurdles. So I'm like 45, 45, 45. And when I landed on that last 45, I had a mid-patellar rupture of my right knee. Same injury John Wellborn had. And when we met and got to know each other, we realized we're the only two people we've ever met that have had that injury, ever. All his years in the NFL, mine in Olympic sports, no one else we've ever met have torn it that way. There's other ways to tear a patella tendon or ligament, but not that way.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, we're the only two that have come back from it. So what they consider the less serious version, we don't know anyone that really comes back very well from it. So I don't know what there is to that, but it's an interesting thing. So, you know, here I am, like 12 weeks to the day, blow out my right knee, disintegrate it. I'm in surgery a couple days later. I'm in a hip cast for 13 weeks.
Damn.
Like, I'm done. When I came out of that surgery, it was a different situation going on. So I came out of that surgery with the inability to walk, inability to like do anything. They were telling me that there was a chance I'd be a stiff straight leg for the rest of my life. Like, it was game over. Yeah, they said, you know, if we're lucky, we'll get you back to what you would consider to be a functional life. That was the conversations I was having at the time, functional life. So I'm like, well, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Right? So I blow up in January, get out of the cast during that semester, start PT with some great PTs out in Wyoming at the time. And then they just send me home for the summer. Like, that's kind of how it works. They didn't see me coming back for my senior year and really doing anything.
Yeah.
You know, so in their mindset, they were probably like, oh, we'll just get him going again in the fall. You know, whatever, he'll be fine. Gained a bunch of weight, did all the things that happen with that type of injury. Well, I go home that summer. Who gets fired? Head coach at the University of Wyoming.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah, because he was breaking and twisting all the rules in the NCAA rule book to have us have this success from, like, things that you don't realize are bullshit at the time, but, like, you know, $10 a day meal stipend on the road for a bunch of athletes.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be 2 to a room, would be 5 to a room.
Really?
Right? Oh, insane.
Jeez.
Just ridiculous, right? But because we're all so self-focused, you know, we would have slept 6 to a bathroom if it meant being an NCAA champion. Right. So, you know, I had 2 years of what now I look back on, especially having coached in college afterwards, is like the most poorly run program on the planet.
Right.
And somehow it still put 4 people on an Olympic team in 2000, right? So like, you're just blinded by it. So I come back my senior year. Now we're going into a new conference. Mountain West has been formed. They won't give me medical red, right? So me and another football player who was a center for us at the time, or no, he was DN, doesn't matter. But Jeff Boyle and I both didn't get our medicals, right? So they didn't want us around anyway. So we had to make do with our last year. Whatever that was, it was going to be. And I remember in the fall of my senior year, you know, I couldn't run, couldn't jog. I was just kind of a mess, right? Started lifting weights, didn't really know how to train around this injury. Thankfully, we had a new coach who's still there to this day and was really patient and kind of just worked with what he had, right? Barrett's a good dude. I wish I had him when I was healthy. Yeah. He would have been a good transition from Bud and Bart. He would have got me to where I needed to go. But with that being said, I ended up qualifying, and I still don't know how. I couldn't run, jog, jump, could barely lift, but somehow I could spin in a circle with the indoor weight throw. And it's a mystery, right? So qualify for NCAAs, right? Whatever. So I'm going to the NCAAs with just this trashed out leg, squeeze out an All-American.
Really?
I look back on it and like, I don't know how I was able to compete with those guys.
Yeah.
But I pulled out an All-American. I was 8th at NCAAs. Outdoors, I missed the hammer because it takes a lot more speed and dynamic movement than even the indoor weight does. But what it did do is it kind of got me out the door without feeling like it was a complete loss.
On a positive note.
On a positive note, right? And success helps get you hired, right? So it put me a little bit back into the eyes of people. And here we go again. You know, one of the assistant coaches who I wasn't associated with training-wise, Yentes, he was off in his world, but he always saw what we were doing. So he sees me come back from this injury, become team captain at the University of Wyoming in my senior year, make an All-American on a destructed body. So he gives me the push to be hired as an assistant throws coach at Eastern Michigan University, where he had been years earlier.
Yeah.
So he goes, hey, man, I don't know if you'll ever throw again, really. He goes, but I can get you a job because we think you might be an okay coach. And I'm like, oh, my God. So here I am. Now I'm a little bit further from British Columbia, but I'm a long ways from the East Coast, right, or the Midwest. So I said yes, right? Because that was just how my brain worked. So I, graduated University of Wyoming in '01 and took a coaching job right out of college at Eastern Michigan, which had a storied history and distance at that time. And what was interesting about that is I'd always lifted weights and like read the bodybuilding magazines. Like I can tell you about bodybuilding history forever because that's the only avenue I had to get into weightlifting. But it was in 2001 in the fall where I became a strength coach.
Oh, really?
Like that to me is when I went from being a guy that lifted weights and had been pretty good at it for the sake of sport and fun, to being like, wow, I don't have a support system anymore. I'm a $12,000 a year assistant coach at Eastern Michigan. I don't got medical insurance.
Right.
I don't got anyone. So this knee still sucks, right? So what do I do? And that is when I started to study and put the pieces together of what I'd done with Bud, what I'd done at the University of Wyoming, what I'd done with this old East German coach in Canada for a year, which is a podcast in itself. So I started to put all those pieces together, and I started to understand and formulate human performance. Now, by the grace of everything in the world that connects, my brother got recruited to go train with Judd Logan in Ashland that same year. So one of the greatest track and field coaches in history was now my brother's coach.
Oh, really?
And he was only 2 hours away.
Oh, wow.
So all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I'm going to go hang out with these guys and watch their practices and hang out with a four-time Olympian in the hammer throw, Judd Logan. This is going to be bizarre, right? Yeah. And that's exactly what I did. And so I was coaching at Eastern Michigan, Division I. Judd's the assistant coach, Division II, Ashland. He's producing all these superstars, and just a totally different energy. He's smart. He's intricate into his program design. He's connected. He's this bigger-than-life motivator. He's a multi-Olympian, all that stuff. So when you're there, you're just like overwhelmed by this personality. So then I'm like talking to him, and I'm like, I think I'm going to keep throwing. He's like, oh, I'll help you out. He goes, just train on your own. I did for years. You know, he's from Ohio guy, right? So it wasn't like he's a West Coast superstar like a lot of them were at that time of his career. So I just started training. And next thing I knew, I'm training very well. And so he said to me, come into the end of Eastern Michigan that year, and we did okay at Eastern. I mean, we didn't have a big program. He goes, well, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, if I retire today, I'll be a coach forever. And I'm okay with that. But I think I might have at least another attempt at a Canadian national title in me. I'm like, I've never done well at a Canadian national championships, and that was always kind of a goal. I'm like, it's not like the U.S. where it's super deep. It is now. They won the world championships in both events this year, men and women. So that whole story's changed. But back then, it was really hit or miss. And he's like, well, here's the deal. He goes, I could really use an assistant coach at Ashland to help me because my program's getting really big on the throws, but I can't pay you.
Right.
And I'm like, this is how the world changes. I'm like, okay, so maybe, right? So my answer to no pay is maybe, right? Not no.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, maybe. Well, what do I have to do? And he's like, we'll be able to get you into the thrower's house, which, is going to be about $200 a month living expenses, right? He goes, but I can get you 100% of your meals covered for the year. So I took my first real good coaching job for free food. Yeah. Right? Like that was it.
We'll work for food.
We'll work for food. So I went to Ashland my first year. So now 2 years out of college. So I got there in the fall of 2002. We'll work for food and just started training under Judd. And so training under Judd at that point, I got to see his system, and he was connected to everybody.
Yeah.
Like that's the Charles Poliquin connection. That's the Sornex connection. Up to that point, like Bert was the pain in my ass on social media. That was all Bert was up to that point. Like we had fought like dogs, our program and his program, over nothing, right?
Really?
Because we had his coach, right? And so they were like, oh, you get our coach, we hate you. So somehow South Carolina and Wyoming became rivals for no reason. And we'd be on an old school message board.
That's funny.
Hating each other, right? So that's how we met. And then, of course, when I met Judd and then I got to reconnect with Bert, it was like, oh, yeah, all right, we get along. Like this is real track and field. And it was training under Judd that every avenue opened up. And I ended up having success. And, won the Canadian national title in 2003, broke the oldest Canadian national record in 2005. and then retired. So even though I never got the Olympics, I got a couple national teams. I got a national record for a while. But my injury just never truly allowed me the timing of an Olympics. And it was hard for a long time until I understood it from a coaching perspective. From an athlete perspective, I don't think I would have ever gotten over it.
Yeah.
From the coaching perspective, I was like, well, I got injured in 2000, so that year was out.
Was 2000, that was the Olympics?
That was
that year,
I blew up my knee, right? So I blew up my knee in 2000, missed that Olympics. But the injury was so bad that I wasn't really thinking about it, right? Like I was so messed up from that injury, and I was going through such a hard recovery from it,
right?
That I wasn't even thinking about sports anymore.
And then where were you at in 04?
So in 04, I was with Judd, and I was an alternate, which at the time felt like I'd been like steel-toed in the nuts. Like to me, I was like, how could this be? You know, like I've put in this huge amount of work and I'm throwing so far. Canada should send me, yada, yada, yada. 05, I ended up breaking the national record, but it's not an Olympic year. So in 04, and there was other stuff in 04. Like the girl I was dating at the time, she got cancer that year. Like there was just life that also goes with all that. But when I look back on it as a coach, I'm like, well, of course you didn't make it in 04. You only had 24 months of training. Like in 2000, you couldn't walk. In 2001, you were barely walking. And it wasn't until you started training with Judd in 02 that you really went through your first true rehabilitation phase.
Right.
So yeah, you had 24 months to make an Olympic team after literally losing the ability to walk. So, you know, cut yourself some slack.
Is it not decided by just the distance of your throws? I mean, is there not trials that just...
It should be. But a perfect example of Canada's political system can be wrapped up in a nutshell with Athletics Canada track and field. Jen Joyce, who is now one of Canada's best strength and conditioning coaches, threw the Olympic A standard at the Olympic trials and did not make the team because they wanted her to throw it twice.
What the hell? Yeah.
They wanted to keep their costs down for the Olympics.
Really?
Yep. So some of that has changed, I believe, as like private sponsorship has improved in social media. But yeah, so when you think about how things have changed, we had some of the most stringent standards to make an Olympics because we had one of the smallest budgets as a westernized country. Whereas other countries are like, well, you have to send people because that's how they get good at competing at the Olympics.
Right.
Like that's the biggest misconception that I think Athletics Canada had for a long time is, well, we'll send you when you can get what was referred to as podium standard, meaning which you could repeat a distance consistently enough in a window of time that it almost guaranteed that you would get a medal.
Yeah, so if you're not going to win, we're not sending you.
And that's exactly how they looked at it.
Yeah.
And she was in a position back then where for sure she had a shot at a medal in her time period, right? 2004, whatever. You know, so I think there was a number of athletes that really missed opportunity at the world class level because of those. Yeah. And that's just bureaucracy, right? Like that doesn't have anything to do with performance.
It is amazing to me even today, like you say, there's more endorsements today. There's more money in it at all levels and all different sports, right? And obviously some of the shinier sports definitely get more of the advertising dollars and the sponsorships and stuff like that. But it is incredible to me the amount of, even with all that today, and back then I'm sure it was next to nothing, it's amazing to me the amount of dedication and time that these athletes put into, you know, getting to those Olympics and everything they're putting through there. And then, you know, if you get the silver medal or the bronze medal, like financially, it nobody cares. Like it's not, especially if it's not in certain events. Yeah. I mean, if you're silver medal in the 100, you're going to make some money. Or if you're gold medal in the 100, you're going to make some money.
You would hope so. So here's an interesting story. So the last couple of years, and when Judd passed away, he kind of handed me over one of his athletes that wasn't directly under the throws umbrella at Ashland, because Judd went on to be the head coach of that program and had a very storied career. So Trevor was a 400-meter hurdler. So he needed someone to help him with his strength and conditioning. So kind of as Judd was getting back into, because he had cancer and et cetera, so he was kind of getting back into full coaching mode. He needed some help kind of dealing with some other levels of the programming. So I was like, yeah, man, I'll help out Trevor. That'd be amazing. So I helped out Trevor at his first World Championships. And at his first Worlds, he placed third, goes bronze medal, out of nowhere, crushes it, right? Has a smashing performance for the U.S. This year, qualifies again, runs a lifetime best in the semifinals. And where it gets interesting is, so you got a returning bronze medalist for the United States. To be able to qualify for the final this year, he ran, if I remember correctly, the 18th fastest time in the history of the sport, just to qualify for the final. So you're talking one of the most competitive finals in the history of the sport. He is still unsponsored.
Oh.
He just, and I can put on my tinfoil hat and make a couple guesses as to why he's not sponsored, right? He maybe doesn't fit what they're looking for that way in terms of, how he lives his life. It is what it is, right? But with that being said, how can that kid not be $100,000 a year?
Yeah.
How is that possible?
Yeah.
Right? When I think of athletes that have come along before a million times, and for sure now after, they're getting picked up. They're getting contracts. This kid is never going to do something that will make the brand look bad.
Right.
Now, is he the edgiest, wildest guy out there? I don't know. Doesn't seem like it.
Yeah.
Married kid from Ohio. He's got a great wife, great life.
Right.
Right. He's young.
Yeah.
Right? So that answers a lot of questions right there. And so when you look at that, it's like, well, does he have to be more controversial?
Right.
To be worth money? I certainly hope not.
And that's really how it is, even like in the UFC. I mean,
right.
I know several UFC fighters that are good dudes. They're boring as hell. I mean, they're just regular dudes, right?
Yep.
They are not going to make the millions that, and Conor McGregor was also, a freak athlete. So,
sure.
I mean, he backed it up with being good. But
winning does matter.
But there's a lot of guys that get pretty wealthy even on their way up just because they're loudmouths, right? And there's a lot of, bravado there, and they're loud and they're entertainers. But a few of those guys I know just say, like, I just won't compromise who I am just for $1.
For $1. And it's funny that you say that, because that is something that I've been dealing with professionally now for sure 2 years. Maybe not another year, because in full disclosure, I start school in January because the industry that I'm in right now with my personality is not sustainable for me. Mm-hmm. And it's the same problem. So, when you think in 2025 will be the 30th year that I've either written programs or have coached people that have competed at the state through Olympic level in some form or another. And that doesn't mean I only work with people that compete at a high level. What that means is, like, I've developed athletes for 30 years, wherever that falls. Right. Walk-ons to world champs. But with that being said, the industry I'm in as a human performance coach, especially not directly tied to a university or tied to a pro team, was more lucrative for me 12 years ago than it is today.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how to be divisive with information.
Right.
Like, there is right and wrong ways to find success as a coach, for sure. Mm-hmm. But success as a strength and conditioning professional, I mean, there's really only a couple ways to mix that pot. Now, if I go out and create a social media presence that's like, F everybody, these guys don't know shit, that guy's an asshole, don't listen to him, my followers will go up. Right. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
I've seen it, other people do it, I've seen it work. Or start to tell everybody that the weakness in themselves is the fact that they've lost the ability to be masculine. So follow our program, and then they'll tie to themselves to some online TRT and tie themselves to some online supplement company. And they do this whole thing. And it's like, because we create men. And it's like, okay, that's kind of cool. But I've always been in the industry of mentoring people to incredible success. Mm-hmm. And as much as I love doing it, it is impossible to put on social media.
Yeah.
It is the hardest thing that I've struggled with in my industry, is being like, how do I encapsulate 4 years of daily, consistent, non-dynamic, monotone mentorship?
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what.
Yeah, because you're, you know, and I fully admit I don't dive deep into listening to the stuff that you're putting out there. It's not really my space or my expertise or interest. But like when I do watch, and the videos I've seen you watch, you are closer to a professor than you are a Instagram workout personality.
Right.
You know, your level of knowledge and your scientific data, the breakdown, the understanding of the way that moving weights or moving your body affects, and the way you fuel your body to do it affects, literally all the way down to the cells of your body.
Right.
Your knowledge is like, and I'm not the person really to be, making this judgment, but your knowledge is fucking unbelievable.
I appreciate it.
That's
time spent, right, with great mentors.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Like you have had so much experience out there, real world experience, and not just training other athletes, but training yourself and having successes and failures in it. And then also being exposed to so many, it's the same. It's like where I'm at. Like the only reason I am where I am today is because I was exposed to so many different masters of the trade.
Yes.
And then you start to take this and that and a little bit from here and there. And quite honestly, with what I'm trying to build today, I'm really walking into a career path that I don't actually know anything about yet. Like we're making knives, but it's a totally, we walked around downstairs looking at those machines. Like I can't run those.
Right.
And so, but I'm trying to find the right people and take from here and there, and hopefully down the road I actually can run those, and hopefully I can do some of that stuff down there, but it's going to require surrounding myself with really talented people.
Which is an amazing problem to have, right?
Mm-hmm.
And see if this makes sense to you. So probably, it's got to be for me 15 years ago now, because I'd come through a collegiate system where I got, dosed by different coaches that I had no control over. I had my original coaches I loved, had my coach that wasn't the greatest, but in full disclosure, I probably loved him when I was winning until I got hurt. Right. You know what I mean? Like we're fickle bastards in the mirror. So, when I look at that, and then I look at the coach that came after. So my mindset very early on, because I had good coaches and bad coaches, what I realized with human performance, at the end of the day, if you take out the desire to use it as a revenue stream, just purely, I got to say what I need to say to make money, but you're like, oh shit, I'm going to be the guy that this athlete is like eye to eye with when it all goes south because we fucked up.
Right.
That is a reality that the internet doesn't dive into.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Right. So I came from that world where I had to develop a style of coaching or a methodology to coaching where when I'm sitting there with that athlete and we're having the hard talk, right? Or maybe I'm sitting across from me, 20 years ago going, I think your career is over. Mm-hmm. I think I might have caused you to never have an athletic moment of success, right? That can happen, right? So there's a responsibility to that's different when you're going to be with someone for a long period of time. And what I realized, and see if this makes sense, is because I looked at mentorship and I looked at the industry, is I would take all these different people and I would read it all. I would study it all. I'd look at it all, and I'd try to be as non-biased as possible. But what I realized is that you could have like 7 talking heads all screaming at the same time about their methodologies. But if you really listened, somewhere in the middle, there'd be overlap.
Yeah.
Where they had no choice but to agree because those were the principles or steadfast points that couldn't be manipulated. Like everything else might just be personality or salesmanship or marketing, but there's going to be something in the middle where all 7 that hate each other are like, well, yeah, you have to do that or you won't be successful.
Right.
And that is 100% where I put all my energy.
Right.
So for me, I was like, I don't really need to have a relationship with any one of these coaches, but I really want to study what they agreed on. And I put all my time in it.
Yeah.
And the problem is it's kind of milquetoast.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's nothing exciting about fundamentals. Like,
well, and social media is built around exciting. I mean, that's so it's tough. I mean, we got Henry hired over here to make badass videos and make things exciting.
Right.
Right. Because actually manufacturing knives is boring as hell. I mean, we're a manufacturing company. We're making thousands of knives, and you're putting lots of pieces together. And it's this, we're going to do the same thing tomorrow and the day after that. So, figuring out how to make the boring exciting, but also authentic, is a challenge.
Very tough.
And not to appear fraudulent or not authentic,
Yep. And to be able to do it on repeat so that everyone gets the same quality. Right. It's, and that's kind of the issue that I've run into. Like you get away from all the algorithm stuff that we're all dealing with. And, maybe our friends don't align with their friends, or something's going on where the marketing dollars aren't being driven towards us. You get rid of all that stuff and you look at kind of the issue that I've run into as a coach and as a performance coach. And it really just comes back to that. It's like, I heard that before. I heard that 10 years ago. I heard him say this, 15 years ago. And I get that a lot. It's like, yeah, but he wrote an article about that for T-Mag in 2012. And it's like, well, yeah, because nothing's changed since 2012. I'm just reminding you that the way that you want to do something to be extremely successful has to follow this path.
Right.
Now, you can add your personality to it, and I hope that you do. Mm-hmm. But on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, this has to happen. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't, it's not going to be achieved.
Yeah.
Or you will not get to the level of success you're capable of. But you want to bring your flair to it. Awesome. Mm-hmm. But it's got to be this.
Yeah, and the challenging thing with coaching, really almost all coaching, you take the highest level out of it, right? Take being the head coach of, the Broncos out of it.
Yeah.
Coaching in general, in high school, college, and even in the pros, there's not much money in it. No. It is a challenging. My cousin was a football coach, and he did the whole climbing the ladder through coaching from as soon as he was done playing football, college football, for the next 20 years of, from this JUCO to that JUCO to this and maybe, to a head coach at that JUCO to back to a coordinator at, this college, right? But it's Division II now, right? Yep. And then it's working your way up to the head coach of this, and then back to a coordinator in Division I, and in this bouncing around, and then all of a sudden you're somewhere for 2 years, and the head coach changes.
Absolutely.
It was. And then the amount of hours I saw him spend, like these coaches, he was coaching for the Bobcats at MSU. And he worked his way up to kind of assistant. They kind of called him assistant head coach, but he was really more in charge of special teams, and then really in charge of recruiting. Because frankly, he knew, because of that pipeline of his experience for 20 years, he knew every program in the state, every high school football coach in the state, and he had this amazing knack to be able to walk into a mom's home, and an hour later, that mom wants to, give her son to him. Right?
100%.
And he genuinely loves the kids and genuinely believes and acts what he says. But the minute the college season was over, and his 20-hour days in the college during season just transitioned into recruiting, and then it just transitioned into summer ball and prep for season, and he was still living and renting a house with college kids on the football team, right? Like still living at 45 years old, 40 years old, like he was 19 and in college. because it doesn't pay at those lower levels until you get the head job, or maybe a step below that. It doesn't pay enough to even rent your own home.
No, and
the instability of it, and that was when he finally quit coaching was, and I didn't talk to him about the reasons why or whatever, but like they changed head coaches. Personally, I would think they should have made him the head coach, but the new head coach came in, they bring in their own staff, and then they have their own, even if they retain you, they have their own ideas about how they want to run their program, how they think they should train or run an offense or defense. And there's just no stability in it long term.
So it's funny that you bring that up, because oddly enough, I had a job interview on Tuesday, and it was with an agency that, to me, represents stability, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the questions that they brought up in the interview, and it was an intensive interview, because they know all your history, and they look at it, and they're like, well, why would you stay with us? Like, you clearly have had these opportunities. You've gone overseas, and you've worked for these different people, and you've done all this different stuff. Like, why would you stick around? We're looking for 20-year guys. How can you make that guarantee to us? And it made me realize that the perception just is so skewed. Mm-hmm. And so, in the interview, I broke it down. I'm like, well, you have to understand that the vast majority of coaches, even at the high level, for sure, the majority have been through at least one marriage, right? Which happens from the instability of the lifestyle.
Right.
And the lack of...
100%. He was single his whole football career.
So it's really hard for that. And I go, and the average coach is going to live, 12 different states in the course of their career if they're successful, because they're going to go where the money takes them.
Right.
So they may have a bank account when it's over, hopefully, if they've been successful, but they're going to have such a disassociated life. They're not going to have friends that they really bond with. They're not going to have a hunting spot that they know has been there since they were a kid. Mm-hmm. They're not going to recognize anything other than the inside of a football field or a weight room.
Right.
And so what ends up happening is you spend all your time where it's most familiar, because that's what feels safe.
Yep.
And in return, you're as important as the color of the uniform you're wearing, right? So if it's crimson or green or yellow, whatever the wind blows, that's who you're loyal to.
Right.
Right. And you're going to be loyal until they're not. We used to joke about it, even the short stint I spent in the NFL, like the joke that we had was, as a strength coach in the NFL, you're the last to be hired and the first to be fired, right? Because they're going to pass the blame for winning seasons to the lowest common denominator.
Right.
Strength coaches go first, right?
Yeah.
It's very rarely are you a Buddy Morris, right? Buddy has been, a beacon or a North Star for the strength industry, because he was one of the first in, and he's one of the guys that's been around the longest. He doesn't
What team?
I think he's Arizona now, doesn't get fired. He was at Cleveland right before I came in, Pitt for a long time, but he was Marino's coach. Like, he goes back, right? So guys like that are not, well, so Buddy Morris, who I think of as is the exception to the rule, I know for sure he's been Pitt 2 different times, Cleveland, Buffalo, Arizona.
Right.
Right. So, I mean,
he's still moving around.
Yeah, he's been married twice. Right.
Yeah.
So I look at Buddy, who's...
And what's a strength coach in the NFL make?
So he set the standard when he was at Pitt, and it changed everything. A guy that probably became about $300,000 plus a year.
Okay.
So like real money.
But there's 32 of those.
There's 32
in the world.
Yeah. You want to know what I got paid as a low-level assistant in the Cleveland Browns? I got $600 a week.
Yeah.
Give me a break.
Yeah.
Right. And people are like, well, why didn't you make it a career? And I'm like, how?
Yeah. Cause I'm actually surprised that number wasn't just much over $100,000. Mm-hmm. And you can make a living at that. But the point is it's, there's as many strength coaches in the NFL as there are starting quarterbacks. Yeah. Pretty hard to become that guy.
Real hard to become that guy.
And
it's a lineage position.
It's a lineage position. Yeah. You got to know people. And it's also, a long road of hard knocks generally. Like, you're probably not going to come out of, college and just be the head strength coach somewhere. Like, there's got to be, some resume that you've put together there.
It seems like it. And it seems like there's still that mindset within the collegiate system that you really have to go through what they went through.
Yeah.
And when the guys making 6 figures plus went through some garbage, they're still around to pass it down. And it's like, well, it's 2023, right? Like, we don't have to still live by 1987 rules for your first entry-level job, right? Like, what I made as an assistant at Eastern Michigan, somehow I felt like I had money. But then again, I also worked for food. So, but when I was at Eastern Michigan making like $12,500 for that year, I mean, you got to think about I didn't even have to pay tax.
Right.
I made so little money as a coach, I didn't have to file taxes.
Yeah.
Put that in perspective.
I have a question for you, and this just popped up. I was talking to a guy the other day that did a short stint in the NFL, linebacker, and he was talking about the difference, because we were talking about my son, and my son's, working out and playing, he's a freshman in high school, right? And so, like, what's he doing for training and whatever, right? And it's interesting to me how much the training changes and the dynamics and the way that they train from high school to college changes, and then even college to the NFL. But he said in the NFL, it was never just about like how much can you squat or how much can you bench. It was all about how fast can you move the weight.
Right.
It was all about explosiveness. And it's interesting because he was talking about how much different and how much of a shocker it was, especially because a lot of that did come in college compared to high school.
Right.
He trained all through high school and then got to college, and it was like overnight you don't know anything. And
Right.
The way you train completely changes.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of truth to that. And I would guess that he probably was playing during the carry-on generations of the like Dave Tate, Buddy Morris, Louis Simmons influence into human performance, especially football in particular, where they started to move away from like the older models of like max strength, big bench, big squat. That was athletic. Yeah. They started to move to measured bar speeds. They started to move into things that equated to, okay, so if I don't have to use 100% or 80% or 90%, but I can get into a measurable bar speed at 70%, there's going to be a greater correlation to that to the field. And I would agree. I think there's a lot of truth to that. The thing that I found working hybrid between the collegiate NFL and also working with what I'd consider to be the very best private sector strength coaches in the world in terms of performance, like an Ian Danny in Arizona. The guy is, he just produces the best off-season performers in the NFL, and he has for years. Like Harrison for the Steelers was his guy. Like that's why he played for 40 years. They're going to bridge that gap a little more. They're going to integrate a lot more of the prehab, rehab, how to make an athlete bulletproof before I make them real fast and dynamic. But where we saw in the collegiate NFL trickle down is a lot of these guys go to the light bar, fast bar methodology because it's very unlikely that they'll ever hurt somebody training that way.
Yeah.
And the idea of longevity of their career kind of gets balanced to the risk and reward of the weight room.
Yeah, there again is the strength coach. You tear some star's bicep off his arm, and you do that once or twice, they're going to get rid of you in a hurry.
And you will be hard-pressed to find a job again. And there was a coach at Cleveland previous to when I was there that had injuries in the weight room, and that was his reputation. And bad things can happen. I think we saw it with John Jones, right? He's out with that pec tear right now. I get that injuries in the weight room can happen for sure. But if you're not a weightlifting athlete, they really shouldn't happen. I make that argument a lot that the weight room, and I fully admit, I had a kid in college box squat almost 900 pounds. I mean, we lifted weight, and he was only 238 pounds. But with that being said, the weight room is designed to prevent and maintain the body. If the injuries are starting to show up as a byproduct of improper training methodology, there's a miscommunication between you and the coaches. Like you're just maybe not on the same page, right? So you're not correlating what you guys are trying to achieve, and or you are trying to fulfill a status within your own coaching resume that is unnecessary, right? Yeah. And that's what I try to tell up and coming coaches. If you want to go into, if you want to stay in private sector and you don't have to worry about drugs and you don't have to worry about testing and you don't have to worry about all this other stuff that comes with the private sector, yeah, do whatever you want. I mean, your success will be 100% determined by people wanting to train with you. Whatever that is, it is. You know, that's for them to figure out. If you're going to stay within the confines of a tested, organized world from high level high school, like my brother's in Midland, Texas now, that's high level high school, all the way up to the NFL or Olympics, and you have to play by their rules, which is performance on the field, you have to accept very early on that you are a cog in a big machine.
Yeah.
And you are an important cog for championship success, but you are not one of the cogs that will be seen.
Right.
And if you do it really, really well, no one will ever really know that you were a part of that success.
Right.
And that's tough,
right?
Because most people get into human performance because they liked human performance, and the inevitable reality of someone that is a big time weight room person is they were probably pretty good at it.
Yeah.
And it brought them a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And to now take on a role of mentorship that is like essential on being invisible but successful, a silent professional, really difficult.
Yeah.
And that's, I own it. I own that right now. I suck at the visible side. I can get up at Sornex and give a presentation about human performance or motivation or do that for an hour. And I'm pretty good at it because all the years I spent lecturing on the road with Poliquin. But you put me on social media and try to like shine up that turd, good luck. Like, it's just not what I'm good at.
Yeah.
Like that constant salesmanship for someone to understand why it is important that you do what I believe is important, I don't got it.
Yeah.
And I own it.
Well, I don't know about that because I do the stuff I've watched. I mean, what I see is somebody that I guess the piece of it that I think you've got is like, it's very obvious very early on that you're highly credible. Like, you know what you're talking about. Like, you're not just hiding a bunch of bullshit,
right?
With some fancy shit. But, you know, for maybe for a lot of people, you know, they don't recognize stuff like that, or maybe you don't value it as much as they should. But
or maybe there's just so much of it out there.
Well, that's the other thing I was going to say.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. Maybe it's, you know, I follow several people in the fitness industry, you know, guys and gals. So then the algorithm maybe thinks I need to see it all.
Right.
But I mean, the suggested feeds, the amount of people putting workout program stuff, you know, fitness influencer person, and the amount of people trying to become that fitness influencer person, or, you know, I'm friends with the guys at First Form, right? And the amount of people that want to be a First Form Legionnaire.
For sure.
I mean, it's bonkers how many people are out there, and to sort through as an uneducated person that wants to get in shape and find actual good, you know, true training.
It can be hard.
Yeah.
So
really hard.
When I left the NFL, I got picked up by a company called the Poliquin Performance Institute. Charles Poliquin at the time was considered probably the greatest, if not one of the leading voices worldwide in human performance curriculum. He had been one of those private high dollar guys. You know, he was the guy, right, at the start of the social media boom. Internet had been around a while. That's how he got famous. But he was an Olympic coach that produced a lot of content for the early days of Muscle Media 2000, was an author for them, wrote for T-Mag, started his own education system. And we had a lot of coaches come through our system. Good coaches, you know, like legitimately good coaches, gym owners, like, you know, Nick Mitchell in the UK now has gyms all over the world. These were all students at one time that came through the system. And Charles looked the part, you know, like Charles had a 20-inch arm on a 5'4" body, like, and he was brilliantly autistically smart. He was a little hard to take sometimes because he was quite abrasive, but that's who I worked for in the private sector. So I learned very quickly how to teach and public speak because that's what I did for a living. You know, I did 200 days a year on the road lecturing to coaches, and typically 12 countries a year. So that's what I did in a gap period as the internet was exploding. And I remember thinking back then, if these guys all own gyms, guys and girls, and this was the thing that caught me off guard, other than a 1%, they were all good looking, they were all super fit, they were all charismatic, they were all good at what they did, and they were all really knowledgeable.
Right.
And I remember thinking back then, how is this market sustainable? And this is like Instagram really wasn't doing much yet. Facebook was still the go-to. And I remember Charles back then with a successful company, multiple coaches, he had 50,000 followers on Facebook. And that was a big deal because the algorithms didn't exist yet. And he had it figured out mathematically within his company that every new follower he got represented $1,000 income from his supplement company a month.
Wow.
Right? So that he had it like it was all really easy to correlate.
Yeah, that was his kind of top of funnel.
Yep. And so when we look at that, and I kind of think now, here we are in 2023, and I'm like, oh, Charles, you know, who's since passed, unfortunately, but I'm just like, man, if you could only saw what was coming.
Yeah.
Like everybody, like AI and all the stuff that now is mixing into that pot, because we don't even really know what's real anymore. In terms, in human performance, people have to understand this with the strength side is really a problem. It's not a tangible product, right? The result, if you stick with it, is tangible, right? But anybody can write anything, but it doesn't mean much. It's all fiction. A workout, even the greatest workout ever written, is fiction until fulfilled by the athlete. We are simply a pen. They're the sword. They always will be. Yeah. So you don't know if that workout even is a legitimate process to a goal until the goal has been achieved or failed.
Yeah, and I you know, we've actually talked about this several times here lately about where we're going with manufacturing and what effect AI is going to have on it.
Yeah.
But I never even thought about it from like a fitness perspective. I guarantee I could probably open up my Chat GPT right now and ask it to make me a program that makes my biceps bigger.
It takes 2 seconds.
Yeah, and how where is that information coming from? What's it based in, and what kind of science and how legitimate and credible is that? It, you know, so how does the regular person parse that out? And then also, you know, when I watch your stuff, you know, no offense, but like if you dive so deep with technical terms and you kind of get down the scientific rabbit hole, you start to lose people, right? Like if I talk about heat treatment of steel and I start getting into the, you know, to the nose curve of when it goes from, you know, martensite to perlite and, you know, and bainite and what temperatures that we're going for a martensitic quench on and, you know, and right. And it's
you're going to have me watching going, oh, this is cool. And everyone else has turned it off.
Yeah. And it's like this, like, so you dumb it down and you're like, this steel's better than this steel and watch us cut a 2x4. Right. And it sucks because like I actually want to have on the on my podcast the guy that actually invented the steel that we're using.
Right.
But he will go down. Well, his literal website is called Knife Nerds. I mean, he is going to nerd out on it in a deep way, right?
Deep way.
But the average knife consumer is going to watch his stuff for minutes, and he's the foremost expert in the nation. And they'll turn around and they'll read a goddamn blade forums and listen to some dude that's some fat ass that sits in an office somewhere that takes some knives out and chops some shit and take his advice on what the best steel is out there or what the best edge geometries are just because of what the guy did out in his backyard.
100%. YouTube heroes, right?
Yeah.
So when I look at, I posted a video a couple days ago and it was a YouTube video I did 11 years ago. Because 11 years ago, I thought that was an interesting way to get information out, not realizing that whatever, I should have done it for way longer than I did. Did it for like 3 years. You know, I had a lot of views. People thought it was cool. But I didn't like how it was coming across. Now I go back and I watch it and I'm like, oh, this is the standard. This is the standard of how people are doing it. It's short, kind of offensive, a little salty. Me just talking about something I didn't like or some bullshit in the industry. I'm like, oh, that's weird. That's really strange. I was doing this a decade ago. Anyway, but to the point with the AI, with the human performance side, because it's the world is full of white belts in strength and conditioning, and Charles knew that right away. He said that we only ever get to use about 10% of our strength and conditioning expertise, and he was brilliant. You know, he coached 200 Olympians, medalists, not just people that had made it to the games. He goes, everybody that we spend the vast majority of our time with, our white belts are just starting. He goes, it doesn't have to be complex. He goes, the hard part is trying to figure out how to teach them white belt information when you are black belt thinker.
Yes.
And he said it's really tough. And I still struggle with that.
Well, that's why they say like some of the very, very best athletes, like Michael Jordan would probably make a terrible head coach.
Terrible head coach.
You know,
very possible. And And what I find is speaking to the camera or talking about it, I have a hard time conceptualizing it down. Coaching people every day just becomes a conversation. It's very easy to be white belt when you got 4 years every day. For me,
Right.
like, to me, everything's at the end of the day, coaching is a story. I'm just telling stories, and in the story, there's some information that is going to help you get to that end result. When AI jumped in on this, what we found right away is that it solved the white belt problem immediately, because you don't have to have. Well, here's a perfect example. Because I made the mistake when social media, and I own this mistake, and there's nothing I can do about it. I made the mistake 15 years ago of seeing social media as a way to reach people I couldn't reach, and I started blogging, writing, and sharing as much information as I possibly could.
Right.
So there's so much stuff that I've written that is now available on social media as the greater whole, that when AI starts to pull information, because I tested it and I was shockingly impressed and scared at the same time, is I'll go and I'll be like, write me a 12-week periodized program for back squat in the style or voice of Derek Woodske.
Yep.
And it does it really well.
And I when I started playing with AI, kind of only really started learning about it last winter on an airplane from a guy. Right. And he owns a company, and they got rid of 6 people that wrote all of their copy for all of their stuff, and utilizes AI. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And so I started asking AI. I downloaded it, started playing with it, and I started asking AI a bunch of stuff about, Damascus steel or a bunch of, knife stuff, which frankly is like way off the beaten path, right? Like, you would think that the information that you'd find on something like that's real obscure compared to, normal life stuff. It was really freaking accurate. I mean, I was blown away. And there's places here and there where it doesn't quite get it right. But I mean, it was scary good for how early the technology is. Because what happens when that technology is 10 years from today?
So this is where I thank God for companies like this that you've created, or the fact that AI will never run the 100-meter final. But athletes may become, in our situation, a lot more autonomous, right? Because, a Trevor Bassett won't need me to write his program anymore, right? He won't. Now, he may need the coach to coach him technically from the sidelines, maybe.
But what he's going to need, and this is where so much about what makes a good coach, so much of it is the mental part. And it's you are also a PhD psychologist.
Right.
And that's the part that can't be replaced. Because, I mean, you could watch a video on the right technique on something. It's amazing what you can go learn.
Yeah.
You probably could find, the program that's going to pretty much have it right and schedule it out.
Yeah.
But when his body isn't quite performing like it should, and his weights aren't going where they should, and he's questioning why, and he's starting to doubt everything or get frustrated, or he does tweak an ankle,
and he's alone.
Right. And starts to get frustrated and feel like in the Olympics or 3 years from now, and you're staring into the abyss of training.
And it is an abyss. It is an endless pit of nothing.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing, there's no feedback, right? And I used to tell coaches that would come for mentorships or things that I would do with the Poliquin, where we would get away from the lecture side or the curriculum, and I would just start talking to them, and I'd be like, here's the deal. The thing that I excelled the most at, and it was a direct byproduct of Judd as my coach, because I had Judd long enough that I was able to glean that information from him. I said, the thing that separated me as a successful coach is the fact that every single day that I would sit and have a conversation with my athletes, every single day I was slowly but surely adding sand to that vessel, and that sand was going to give them the weight of winning.
Yeah.
Right. Every single day, no matter. And when I think of the short window I had in the NFL, I had a player say to me one time, and I took it as a compliment. And everyone just called me D. It was just a standard, right? Derek is one of those words that gets shortened immediately. So he's like, D, here's the deal. He goes, the thing that separates you from the other coaches is he goes, we come in every day and we don't know if they're going to be high or they're going to be low. We don't know. He goes, with you, it doesn't matter what's happening. You are always the exact same.
Right.
And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, ooh, is that good or bad?
Yeah.
And now all these years later, I'm like, well, that's me.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how else to be. It's like Judd told me one time, he said, your greatest performances will be the accumulation of your best average.
Mm-hmm.
He goes, averages win world championships, averages win Olympic golds. He goes, so you got to bring up your average.
Right.
He goes, sometimes you have that day that's amazing. He goes, we hope we don't have the day that collapses us. He goes, but over time, the collective of your work will be the highest average you performed at.
Yeah.
He goes, everything else, it's fleeting. He goes,
Right.
so bring up your average. And he goes, now, if your highest average becomes consistently good, he goes, you will always be successful.
Right. That's where you start getting into Hall of Fame territory.
Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really interesting, and I though I definitely don't work out like I should and stuff. My kids are very involved in it right now, and I actually, as a parent, find it very difficult to know even how to advise a kid, right? Because I have a kid that's kind of a freak as far as size, right? He's about 6'4", and he's a 205 or 10 pound freshman, right?
Perfect.
So he's got the vessel, right?
Yep.
Like he's got that, and was gifted by God with that. But when you start to look at, like, you also don't know when a kid's growing that fast. You don't know what he's going to be someday, right? So like, do you train him to be a tackle?
Right.
Do you train him to be a quarterback? The basketball player, the shot putter, because like he does all those things, right? He is the quarterback, but then he also wants to fly up and down a basketball floor and dunk it. So he doesn't want to bulk in like a way that you would want to, like a defensive end or guard or a tackle to bulk, right? And so he also has size 15 shoes, so he's not
done
as quick as he should be, and he's also not done growing. But my big thing is with him is like, we got to develop some more foot speed and some more speed and quickness. And I've told him, like, you have time down the road, depending on what you end up doing, to put on the mass and the size. Mobility and quickness and functional strength is, to me, is really, really important. And it's hard to know, and it's interesting. You see them doing, heavy bench and heavy squat and some of that stuff, and then you talk to people who have been there, done that, and been in the NFL, and they're like, no, they've got these deals they attach to the bar, and they put 150 pounds on it, and want to know how fast you can move it, or 200, 300 pounds, and how fast does it move, and it's like, well, shit, they're not training that way at all here,
Right, and they're both right and they're both wrong. So the one thing that we learned very early on is every great athlete at some point went through the process of getting really strong. Mm-hmm. Because really strong doesn't necessarily mean really big, right? There's relative strength, there's absolute strength, there's all these different measurable things with the human performance side. But the big thing that we used to look at is there is not a sport on the planet that doesn't positively respond to making athletes extremely strong, right? So the Germans used to refer to it as the mother quality, right? So it didn't matter if you're a weight class wrestler or fighter or Olympic weightlifter or a female pole vaulter. The thing that would shock people is how incredibly strong some of the most unassuming world-class athletes really are. Sergei Bubkas of the world, that were pole vault world record holder, doing 100 or 200 kilos, 220-pound walking lunges for sets of 400 meters.
Yeah.
Right? And this is a guy that's, just nuts and ribs and shredded all the time, right? But he could also run an 11-second 100-meter holding a pole vault pole.
Yeah.
Right? So when you start to look at how strong athletes really are, and a good example is I was fortunate to be a Cleveland Brown when Joe Thomas was a rookie.
Yep.
Right?
Center.
Yeah. Tackle.
Tackle.
Yep. And Brady Quinn. So they were both there, both freshmen, which was kind of wild.
Joe Thomas, a guy that was like so big in the NFL, and then as soon as he retired, he just became shredded.
Right? Started swimming and watching his diet really healthily. But he was not a big man. Oh, he's tall. Don't get me wrong. But like Joe was not like he wasn't a Ryan Tucker who just took up a doorway just by pure mass. Mm-hmm. But what people forget is that Joe was like, could have been and was on the path to also be an elite glide shot putter for Wisconsin. And he makes the direct correlation to his kick step as a tackle having been a byproduct of being a glide shot putter because the techniques were similar.
Yeah.
And Buddy Morris talks about this a lot, is the fact that until the sport finally chooses you, and that's going to be for a lot of reasons, personal, emotional connection to it, maybe you just aptitude out. Like it's just so clear that that's what you're meant to do, that you do it. Until that point comes, and a term that has been lost is bilateral transfer, meaning which you play everything for as long as possible until the sport chooses you. You know, like until the day I graduated high school, I threw 3 events, competed in snow skiing, did water skiing all summer, rode motocross as much as possible. And then eventually I kind of funneled into this very niche sport that you don't do anything else but that. But the reason I think I was able to supersede the circumstances of myself geographically and get to a level of success is because my bilateral transfer had been so high and I'd done so much, and I'd put time in the weight room. You know, like Wellborn always uses it as a note of fun when we talk. You know, because the first time I ever did a back squat was in a competition. I was 16 years old. I squatted 420. Right. So but I had no idea what that meant. No one did. It was at a boat and farm show in Golden, right? They had a local gym was trying to sell memberships, and they're like, hey, a squat contest. Everyone was just lining up and squatting, right? Yeah. So I'm 16. I'm like, I'm going to do this. And just
the disc replacement surgeon standing there with his business cards.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, so not knowing it, but retrospectively, I look back, I'm like, I had all the gears. They just hadn't been put together in the machine.
Right.
But it was that bilateral transfer that created those gears in the first place. I did so much.
I believe, and this really came around, I think, really when my oldest daughter, you know, she's 19. So I really think my daughter grew up in the era, and my kids have, in the era that really was fully transformed over into like the AAU sport world.
Right.
Like the generation before that, it was kind of happening, but like, I think really in the bigger cities, bigger areas, by the time my kids came along, like if you wanted to be in a sport, you needed to be in club, AAU, whatever. It wasn't just, hey, school ball's going on now, we do this. Then all of a sudden, okay, now the school ball in this sport's going on. Like I play basketball, and then I play volleyball, and then I play football or track, right? Yep. And it really turned into like, if your kid wants a scholarship from the time they're 7 years old, they just have to play soccer.
Right.
That's all they can do. Yeah. Or they can just play basketball. And where I will agree with, and I say this to a lot of people with young kids, is if you do want your kids, in general, there's freaks out there, but if you do want your kids to play high school sports, you better get them involved in sports early, because if the first time they pick up a basketball is junior high basketball in 7th grade, the amount of talent out there, unless you're at a real small school, the amount of talent out there, it's such a gap to make up. Like technical skill stuff. Yeah. If it's just strength and speed, that's one thing.
That's a whole nother conversation.
But I was anti completely on my kids just selecting a sport, even like freshmen in high school. Like my kids play all the sports.
100%.
And I also think part of that, like, there's the physical side of it. There's also just the burnout factor mentally of it. There's the also meeting different friends. Like this friend group kind of tends to play volleyball, and this friend group tends to play basketball. Yep. But if you play them all, you kind of meet all those kids. You hang out with different kids. You don't hang out with the same 6 teammates 365 days a year.
100%.
Different coaching, different coaching. Styles of coaching.
Learning how to interact with different people under different tasks. The neuroplasticity of having multiple discipline coaches and having that that crossover of movement pattern, right? So, having played volleyball and basketball, movement patterns are very different, right? The dynamic nature of being an outside in volleyball is going to correlate to other sports where basketball perhaps doesn't. But there's going to be the psychological peripheral development of seeing movement come from outside of you in basketball that you don't necessarily get in volleyball.
Right.
Other than like setting up for the set to come in from an angle that may be posterior to your view, it's still going to end up where it's supposed to end up so you can make contact with it. Like that, volleyball is different that way. When you look at those factors, you look at football and the fact that there's equipment involved, there's going to be and the thing that you say is so accurate is the fact that you get kids involved very, very young. So it starts to desensitize them to the experience. So that part of it gets trained out of you very early. And then on top of it, you start to learn the things that are rudimentary so that you can focus on just the activity, right? You learn what a pass route is. You learn what pass block. You learn all this very simple stuff. Doesn't mean you're going to be good at it or it's your natural aptitude, but at least the social aspect of the team practice doesn't get hijacked because you have no clue what's going on, which then creates this very disruptive dynamic with you as a person, right? Like there's a lot that goes into that. So there is something to be said about that with the development. And, I've obviously worked with coaches in the NHL as well. And they say a fascinating thing is starting to occur. And one of the guys that's like Under Armour Canada, he had been in the NHL strength and conditioning side for a long, long time, was telling me that it used to be kind of believed in the NHL that by 16, 17, that if you hadn't made, major, junior, like WHL or something, that you're probably not going to make it to the show. Like that was kind of like, it was a young sport for introduction. And he said a lot of athletes got washed out at 16, 17 because they weren't good enough to make it to the NHL.
Yeah.
He said, whereas today, he goes, they're seeing a much, much later development window. He said like the 16, 17-year-olds that he remembered working with that might even get a entry-level contract to the North Stars or whoever back then. He said, they had beards and were big and like all this.
Well, think of the amount of change, especially with boys. Girls do develop a bit earlier, and you don't see as much change between 16 and 18. But the amount of change between 16 and 20.
Huge.
And I'd say even 16 to 25, because you do see some guys have amazing transformations into their 20s.
Yes. And if you miss that window, you may simply miss them, what they actually were capable of.
Yeah. So like my ex-brother-in-law, he's 6'8", 300 pounds. He's a monster. And he played high school basketball. His dad wouldn't let him play football because he was a beanpole. Just a beanpole. But when he went to a junior college, his first year in his junior college, I think he grew 4 or 5 inches and put on like 40 pounds. And the next year he grew an inch or two and then put on like 50 more pounds. Right. And he went from this beanpole basketball player to when he walks in the room, he's a guy that could play in the NFL. Like he's got legs that are monster legs, right? He's big, barrel chested. Like he has the frame that had somebody taken him at 22, 21 and put him in the workout in a weight room with the right training, like he's legitimate, and he had the basketball footwork, right? Like that, and that's the other thing about playing all these other sports is you learn quick foot speed and side to side movement and backwards movement, and then all of a sudden you develop and you put on a guy like that puts on 100 pounds.
It becomes a completely different animal.
But it was too late for him. Like he had already kind of, like you say, kind of people had passed him up on like being a football player or doing some of these other things, where if some coach would have said, "What's going on over here?" and grabbed him, holy shit, who knows what it turned him into?
There's no question, and I think a lot of that gets overlooked, like stages of development. Like even with myself, I know I grew another 3/4 of an inch in college, and I'm not a super tall guy. I'm like 6'1", but I went from like 6 foot and change to 6'1" in that kind of freshman, sophomore year of college, right? And we think of that bilateral transfer so essential. I can't remember the name of the athlete, but there was a University of Colorado football player that went to the Olympics for freestyle skiing at the same time he was getting recruited to play in the NFL.
Yeah.
Like, so anyone that says it can't be done is just a little bit misguided. And anyone that says it shouldn't be done is completely misguided. You know, unless
I think there's a difference between thinking that the skills you're going to develop in 6th and 7th grade are what's gonna get you your college scholarship. Like, it's the basis of those skills. But
Yes.
like, if you take a winter off from, you know, softball and
Right.
you play basketball and you go back to softball in the spring, that's not going to be the reason you don't get a scholarship 5 years later.
it's just, most certainly is not.
You know, but now if you don't start playing, you know, softball until you're in 7th or 8th grade, and again, there are exceptions to this, but like, I've seen it, and I encouraged some of my daughter's friends, parents, to get them going in 4th grade basketball 4 years ago.
Yep.
And there was this hesitation and the slowness, but I had already seen what was going on with my older daughters. We had been through it, and I'm like, you guys got to get going, because like, there's 5th grade girls out there knocking threes down like crazy,
Right.
and your girls can't dribble, right? Like, this is a gap that's a huge gap, and here we are today. Like, they just put my daughter and one other girl on the high school team as an 8th grader.
Yep.
And these other girls, not that they needed to be to that level, but a lot of these other girls are still getting a lot of the basics. And if they went to a AAU tournament right now as a team, they just get mopped up.
Yep.
And it's going to be a giant gap to bridge to win if you want to win a state title.
It's really tough to do. And like, even when I think volleyball is the first sport I ever did collectively as a team. I started in the 4th grade, right? And we were terrible little kids running around like playing like garbage. That's 4th grade volleyball. It's what it's supposed to look like, right?
Right.
No one can really set or do any of that crap. But what it did is, by the time I got to high school, I immediately was able to level up to like junior varsity and varsity. Like, so I never really played other than 1 year freshman volleyball.
But you learn where to be on the floor. That's the thing when you're a kid.
Yes.
You learn the instincts.
Yep.
Of the game.
And none of it's new.
And then all of a sudden one day you wake up and you're big enough to get over the net and slam it.
Yep. And all the genetic
timing
stuff. It all follows suit. And like my brother's son, he's young. He's already playing flag football. He's going to go right into basketball. And now I could make the argument that at one time in history, this was supposed to be done by physical education class, right? That's what they were supposed to do for us. That is now being done.
I still believe that.
I do too, in the club system. But what it is like, even when you look at the old East German systems, it's just like the run, jump, play methodology. Like, you want kids as soon as possible to start hanging from obstacles, climbing using their hands and feet, running as fast as they can, maybe for as long as they can.
That's like the thing about making these playgrounds too safe anymore. You know, like, we had monkey bars and shit we climbed. Yeah,
super
like,
high.
There were consequences if you let go of that bar.
Yeah, it's
you know, and you had to make a decision. Like, am I going to try that flip that my buddy's doing over there on that 100%.
Bar? Like, if you haven't walked one of your buddies to the office with a broken collarbone, you probably haven't fully developed your adolescence. Like, there was just something to it.
Yeah.
We knew one. There was one kid out of our group. Well, we had a couple, but yeah, I saw my first collarbone break at like, I don't know, 5 or 6.
Yeah.
You know, and it's from the upside down swing on the bars. But at the same time, I think there is a direct correlation to like that type of activity, that it is essential. I'm not going to sit here and say everyone needs to become an athlete, but everyone needs to do athletic endeavors.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between the two, but everyone needs to, and for as long as possible. And then as I get older, I also make the argument that not only should you do them for as long as possible, but try to do them with some people you like to be around.
Right.
Because what I'm finding, watching, people ahead of me on this path, there's something to the cognitive decline that's more than just task-oriented. Like, everyone's like, keep doing puzzles and you won't get dementia. Well, I've seen that fail now. But where I do see a correlation in my own life of people that seem to keep pushing that obstacle further down the road, social interaction. Yeah. So do task with other people. Yeah. And it's like their cognition just stays sharp. Yeah. Right? Yeah. There's no perfect science for that, but I see it.
Right.
And I've had that conversation with my parents. I'm like, hey, it's one thing to stay active because they try to stay as active as they can. I'm like, you got to keep doing it with other people.
Right.
There seems to be something there.
Yeah.
But, I haven't had the conversation with enough specialists to know.
So you made a comment. You're starting school in January?
I am. So I decided that I was going to go back to start online university in January for something completely different from this industry, something that is a massively growing sector, but at the same time, 100% non-dependent on persona, right? So it's going back to a nuts and bolts. Like if I can do this job really well, then that's all that matters.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized, the only thing I regret is probably not going back to school during the pandemic because we all had a lot of time, right? But at the time that was a big transition for me because I just finished with Zach Brown, so that just got a huge pause. I just finished spending almost a decade on the road, right? Between Europe travel and the half a decade I spent in the Middle East, right up to the coup and all the stuff going sideways there because I was a part of that. So it's like, when I look at that period of time, I think going into the pandemic, I was a lot more burnt out than I realized.
Yeah.
So everybody else is like shitting their pants about the world ending. And I'm just like, this
time to rest.
This is rest. This is the first time I remember thinking to myself, I was like 8 months in and I'd been on an airplane every 2 weeks for 10 years. And I remember being 8 months into it, living out in like the Sierra Nevadas. And I was just like, this is amazing. And people are running out of toilet paper and fighting over steaks at the grocery store. And I'm just like, everything's okay.
No shit. What are you studying?
It'll be in cyber forensics, cybersecurity.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So a pretty big deviation from what I do now. Yeah. But I don't think it's that big of a deviation psychologically.
Guy, you're a guy that just does so many different things like volunteering at the, sheriff's department.
Yeah.
And
that was like every other Forrest Gump moment of my life though. Like,
are you still doing that?
Yeah, that's, I was with him last week. So I moved from like doing the posse stuff into full-time reserve, right? So you get to, you're actually doing policing and it's rewarding. It's stressful, right? Yeah. At times if you want to peel off the Band-Aid of humanity, get involved with first responders.
Oh man.
Because there is a world that exists within the world, even in the smallest town, that you just wouldn't know it's there.
Yep.
And obviously I'm going to be very one-sided about the conversation, but because my family was first responders on my mom's side as well, but I go all the way back to then, and it's like, you don't realize how few people are able to manage such a large amount of chaos.
No shit.
All day long.
Yeah.
And it never stops.
Well, it's what's actually scary about if real actual chaos hit this country.
Yes.
It'd be uncontrollable.
Uncontrollable.
Because there just is not enough bodies, enough people.
No, I read a meme yesterday and it kind of made me laugh. And the meme said something to the effect that Scotland has roughly 5 million people. There's roughly 600 million domesticated cats. If they decided to attack Scotland, I don't think Scotland would win. Right? And I remember thinking that, and I'm like, that's kind of what it's like, though. Yeah. It's like there's this illusion of safety around us all the time.
Well, it's like the security at a football game, right? There's 100 security people there for 45,000 fans.
45,000 fans. It's an impossible ask, right? They talk about the 96 Olympics and the bombing of the 96 Olympics. Like, how could have that happened? And it's like, there was 1 million people.
Right.
How does it not happen all the time?
No, exactly.
That's what I'm always asking
Well,
myself.
That's actually what's scary is I'm worried that we're going to start seeing a lot more stuff because
we are on borrowed time.
Yeah.
And we have been for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I think that was partially why I got involved with law enforcement, is just to try to be a part of a new community, but to be a proactive part.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of interesting, like, I got into it relatively by mistake at first. It was something that I'd been thinking about for years, talked to Megan about it, and being like, I wonder if I'm too old. I'd always ask myself, I wonder if a career change of that magnitude is still possible. And so when we moved up to Kalispell, I thought I was filling out a notification for information regarding what they have up there as a sheriff's posse. And the sheriff's posse is like a volunteer organization that helps the community in times of need.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, oh, I should find out what that is. So I filled out what I thought was this information request. And then like a week later, I got an email back, and it was my background check had been completed, and I was scheduled for an interview with like a member of the sheriff's department and this group. And I remember being like, what do I do? And I hadn't told Megan. So I go to Megan. I'm like, I think I applied for something by mistake. And she says, so I describe what happened, and she's like, oh. She goes, well, you want to do it, so just go to the interview. What's the worst thing that could happen?
Yeah.
So I went to the interview, and it went well, and like 3 months later, an opening for college reserve academy with the sheriff's department came up, and I just kind of threw my hat into that one as well. And I'm like, what's the worst thing that could happen? I'm going to go to night school for Monday, Wednesdays for the next 6 months. And if it sucks, it sucks, but let's see. And I came out of that, and I was like, oh, that was worth it.
Yeah.
I was like, not only was it worth it, if only more people had the time for that type of volunteer service, because they sure need the help.
And just the knowledge of what they do, just to have the respect for it. I mean, that's the argument for some kind of required service out of high school, right? Some kind of service. It's not that everyone's going to, stay in that forever, but at least for the rest of your life, you're going to have some education as to what those people go through, what people are out there doing. You're going to see some stuff that you haven't seen. You're going to go into some neighborhoods or some countries or whatever that you would never have seen.
Yep. Things that you wouldn't believe
might
existed.
Make you appreciate things a little more.
It's funny that you bring that up, because through my coaching travels previous, I spent a lot of time in Scandinavia, in Finland in particular, and Finland has mandatory service. And people forget that. Everyone wants to idealize the Scandinavian countries as this beacon of liberal freedom. And it's like, well, they have mandatory military service, right? Like, do we want to have that conversation?
I don't know if they still do, but they had it in Germany as well.
Yep. And it's what's interesting about it is when I spent all that time in Finland, if I remember correctly, and anyone can correct me, I don't care, but it's like with the females, they could take service or they could hand it off into a different type of social service. Because I remember the girl at the time that I was dating, she had gone into a slightly different occupation post-high school, whereas another friend of ours, she eventually became a sniper in the Finnish military, and now she's a doctor. So they could go two different ways. With the males, it was mandatory service, so it was a little bit different.
Yeah.
But with that being said, we were at an event where there was a little bit of a chaos thing occurred, and it was not an event where you would expect it. I think we were at a nightclub and there was a concert. But as an outsider, I looked, and all these strangers immediately kind of clicked in, young guys, young girls partying, right? But they all kind of immediately clicked in, saw the problem, and they all started communicating and working together as strangers because they'd had a unified education at some point in an emergency situation.
Interesting.
And they picked it because if I remember, we got there like a second late. I think the guy had fallen from somewhere and got hurt, enough to knock him out.
Yeah.
But it was just drunk, intoxicated, partying strangers immediately clicked on, solved the problem. The medical came in, they got him on a stretcher, gone, and then it went back to chaos again.
Yeah.
And I remember just having a moment where I'm like, ooh, I don't think we got that gear right now in our country.
Right.
One or two might click on, but I don't know. These guys they look like they all knew each other.
Right.
And now looking back on it, I'm like, yeah, they had unified. At some point, they all had the same conversation about the situation.
Right.
And I think there's something to it.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. Yeah. And just to have the respect level of, when we went through the whole defund the police thing and all that crap, like I think if some of that was required right out of school, you just wouldn't have that stuff,
I agree. I grew up in a town where it was the same mentality as many towns. And I remember going on ride-alongs with the police department when I was young with the RCMP. And I don't even know why. Curiosity, I think, my family's background on my mom's side. And it totally changed it because I lived in a town that had, up to that point, had never had a murder, right? Mm-hmm. Now back in the gold mining days, they're probably shooting each other left and right. But there was no murders in modern history. There's no major crime violations. So we lived in this perfect little Andy Griffith town in the mountains. And then I went on that ride along, right? So we were off to Trans-Canada. Our ski resort still hadn't blown up yet. And we pulled over a guy in the middle of nowhere, British Columbia, who had like a 3-foot long rap sheet back in the day when they had to print it out, who was a wanted bank robber from Montreal, 2,000 miles away,
Really?
that they just happened to catch that night for speeding going through town. And I remember immediately going, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah.
Because I didn't think that existed where I lived.
Right.
That was a city problem.
Right.
You know, and now obviously working with the sheriff's department in Kalispell, it's an everywhere problem. And
yeah, I mean, where I grew up, tiny little Lincoln, Montana logging town, and they caught the goddamn Unabomber.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, you had a Kaczynski. Like,
yeah,
you had the guy.
Yeah, we had the most wanted man on earth at that time in our logging town, of which, like you said, nothing ever happens. I mean, a couple of people get a little too drunk.
Yep.
That's about it.
That's it.
And, you know, then they tell you, you know, that the Unabomber was caught in your town. You start making a list of people you think could be the Unabomber.
Yeah.
And you're like, way off.
Way off.
You're like, God, I could have sworn John was the Unabomber.
For sure.
For sure. If anyone's the Unabomber, it's John.
It's John. That's the guy. He looked the part, right?
Yeah. But no, it's crazy. And you know, it's scary because, I mean, I have several friends in law enforcement around here, and I have a couple friends that are feds that are dealing with drug stuff, and then one deals with child stuff. And I mean, you don't even really want to talk to them because it makes you
second guess everything.
Yeah. It's like, boy, part of me does just want to live with my head in the sand, because that's a lot nicer. Because, I mean, the shit that they're dealing with blows you away.
It is, and it's nonstop.
Yeah. I actually, mentally, it's interesting because I was talking to a guy just a couple days ago, and I didn't know this was a thing. Like, this guy has a Ring security camera or system on his house. What I didn't know is, with a Ring security system, it will alert you as to events that are happening in your area on other Ring security systems. So he'll get a notification that a house was broke into two doors down.
Yep.
Or a car was broke into. And so he lives in a big city. He's constantly getting notifications. Hey, this happened, 1 mile away. Well, 1 mile in a city with a ton of homes is actually a long ways.
Yep.
But a mile also in your brain is close to you. A mile is a lot closer here than it might be in a big city.
For sure.
But he's getting all these notifications, and he was talking about how, like, mentally how bad that is, of like, so you start walking around, you're locking all your windows, you're locking all your doors, and oh, there was a murder over here, or there was a house breaking into here, and he, and then his wife goes to bed and can't fall asleep because she's worrying, like, what if that guy comes, what if our house is next, right? Like, that was only a block away. Like, that's right there. We can see it, basically. And how he had to shut that system, those notifications off, because it's that whole, it's a lot like watching CNN and Fox News every day.
Right.
You consume that day after day after day, and you start to get pissed off or worried or whatever it is. And like, oh, my retirement's going to be gone. We're going to go to World War III.
Right.
And so there is this weird, interesting dynamic of needing to, it's actually healthy to live with your head in the sand to a degree.
Right.
But every now and then you obviously have to pop your head out of the cave and see what's happening.
Yeah, make sure that you're not going to be the last guy to get toilet paper.
So it's weird, and it's odd. It would be very difficult working in the sheriff's department because you would know everything. It's your job to know everything.
Yeah, it's I find it fascinating. I fully admit I do enjoy the complexity of the work for that fact. It did initially make me hyper vigilant to our house and Megan, because I was like, what do you mean our neighbor had someone living under their tree for the last 3 months? How is that possible? I see that tree every day. I've never seen someone. And then literally a guy, because someone else just happened to be up when he made his exit, like parted the bottom of this big spruce, like doors on a tent.
Yeah.
And they realized he'd been living in someone's yard this whole time, has a rap sheet, has a history, has a drug problem.
Right. And your wife's walking out to her car alone and
mowing the grass 300 yards away,
right.
200 yards away. And you start to think about all that stuff. And I think there's something to be said that, yes, there's a place for vigilance, right? You have to be aware of what you need to be aware of. But the other thing, and I probably learned this when I was in the Middle East, because I was dealing with a bunch of stuff over there when I was doing a little bit of executive protection work on top of whatever else I was into, that the people I was working for were a direct target for Al-Qaeda in the past and then some other means of kidnapping because of the value of them. When I first started working over there, I had no clue of this. I was naive.
Mm-hmm.
By year 2, they brought me into the fold through the English security system. We're like, all right, clearly you're going to be around for a while, so we need to catch you up.
Mm-hmm.
Are you interested in X, Y, and Z and being a part of that? And I was like, yeah, actually, I kind of am. Like, yeah, that'd be a nice, like, additional mental challenge and break from just weightlifting. So I got involved with that. And when I was over there, as it was kind of coming to an end and the war down south was kind of kicking off with them, and they were doing a lot of battling at the border, the Houthi rebels started to shoot a lot of rockets into Saudi Arabia. And I remember the first time that happened, like just the overwhelming sound of the Patriot batteries going off and actually seeing rockets come in and just like being like, for the first time in my life where I was like, wow, somebody I have no connection to, no history with, no like levels of moral or spiritual or anything association with, if they can kill me, that's a good day.
Yeah.
And I had no way to prepare for that. But with that being said, like me dealing with that and then trying to explain it to people back here, even my parents and my brother, they're like, huh? That's happening?
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, it's happening all the time right now. They just missed the airport. King Khalid took one off the edge of the runway. And that's when I realized, oh, you can't be on the news all the time. You can't be online all the time, because what I was realizing is there's so much happening here that you have to be responsible for day to day, that media has become so efficient and so good at portraying the struggles of the world that it makes you, if you're a person of good moral standing on any level, you feel what they're going through. Yeah. Like you feel that trauma and stress. And we're not meant to feel that much trauma and stress as humans. Right. I mean, what is it? The Dunbar rules, like the law of 150, close tied relationships were kind of maximized to handle. Now we're trying to handle the emotional welfare of tens of millions of people. We're not designed for that. Right. It's tough. And even to the reverse, like when I was in Saudi, I couldn't focus on all the tragedies that were happening back home. Right. If they came up in the news, I'm like, oh my God, because I can't balance those two. Right. I got too much happening here now. Right. And
which is how a lot of our soldiers' lives fall apart at home.
For sure.
Yeah. No, it's a lot. It's and it only, with our connectivity, which is amazing. It's definitely a benefit, with social media, I'm able to build a company off of it. There's so many advantages and good things for it, but also, for sure. There was a lot of bad stuff happening around the world in the 1980s, and you just didn't know about it.
No.
When we were growing up, and you were just told about a few of the highlights on the news, and then, everything was good beyond that.
Yeah, a guy in Canada getting pulled over with an armed robbery sheet didn't make the newspaper. Right. The newspaper was still talking about the fall fair, the apple grow, and the whatever else. Right. Because that's how you keep people happy. Right. Right. Now, do I think that maybe that's not always the best way? I don't know. But man, I sure miss like cracking open the newspaper and the center spread was the hang gliding world championships. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's like, maybe that's all I really need to know about. Right. Right.
Yeah.
If it's not my tragedy, is it my tragedy? Yeah. There's a strong argument for that.
Yeah. No, I agree. Well, I would love to do round 2 at some point here, because there's so much stuff that I want to cover with you. I actually kind of didn't get into the whole Middle East stuff. You're actually more of your coaching career. There's skiing. There's stuff that you and your wife are doing. Yeah. So I'd love to have you come back down.
Yeah, of course.
I've got a deal I got to get on here pretty soon, but and I don't want to keep you all damn day, but I really would. And actually, I'd love to just have you come down with your wife, and we'll have dinner, and we'll do this. Maybe we'll do round 2 in the evening or something. And
yeah, that'd be awesome. She'd love it.
We keep talking about having a barbecue or doing something, but I think you're one of the most interesting people I've ever met. It's kind of weird because it's not like we obviously talk very often, but just through social media, seeing what you've been up to and learning about your history through Bert and other people. And I love your curiosity and your willingness, like going to school and getting into cybersecurity. I mean, I want to, in the next podcast, like hear what that's all about, and you'll probably be into it by that point.
Yeah, it should be exciting.
Yeah, because like I've also listened to some podcasts lately. Mic Drop podcast, I think it was Sean Ryan show has had a couple people on with like cybersecurity stuff, and I mean it'll blow your mind.
Talk about a podcast that I feel like I got fairly early with Sean Ryan's show.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating show.
Fascinating.
Out of left field for me.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, what is this one day? And this was, I feel like, a year or so ago. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. That guy was an interesting interview.
Yeah.
And now here we are today, and I'm like,
massive. And I don't even know how he gets all these people. I mean, I have to talk to people like you. Like, I can't wait to get some interesting folks.
So full disclosure, the entire drive down was Sean Ryan's Laird Hamilton. That's what I'm listening to right now.
Yeah.
Because I'm a huge Laird Hamilton fan, obviously lifestyle, all that stuff. But I'm like listening to it. I'm just like, oh, I didn't know any of this about this guy.
Yeah.
I knew him as an athlete and a super like longevity driven guy. I'm like, oh, this guy's fascinating. Yeah. But I think that's the only podcast I've ever seen him on.
Yeah.
So
I've never seen him on one. I don't know if Rogan's had him on, but
I don't think so, because I've been a huge fan of that one forever, and I can't remember. Yeah, but there's
a lot of episodes.
Yeah,
yeah. No, the Sean Ryan, that guy, and it's a lot of. I mean, that's one of those. It's a lot of topics that'll make you go, holy shit.
He has opened my eyes on a lot of stuff with his guests.
Yes,
a lot. Like right now, he's top 2 favorite podcasts.
Same.
Yeah, I'm really impressed.
Him and Rogan. There's and Rogans are hit and miss depending on the topic, and that's what's great about Rogans. He'll talk.
Yes.
There's some people it's like, partway through, skip out. Almost every single one that Sean Ryan does, I'm freaking
locked in,
enthralled by it.
Yep. I think going back to Rogan when I used to listen a lot, I'm forgetting the guy's name now, but he guided a guy to the top of Everest who was a blind climber. Mm-hmm. One of the greatest podcasts I've ever heard in my life, that one. And if you give me a Mike Baker, Joe Rogan podcast.
Yeah, which he was just on.
I'm on that. I'm sold.
The one with, Francis Ngannou talking about how he got out of Africa, and got to where he is today. Holy shit, man.
Unbelievable. And when he got The Rock to talk about the time he spent coming up.
Yeah, and I'm only 30 minutes into the Rock one right now.
I laughed so hard listening, because when he got The Rock onto wrestling, or maybe The Rock got them onto wrestling, who knows how it happened. It just was kind of organic. It's when you realize how much that guy loves wrestling.
Yeah.
And sports. And whatever that was he was a part of, because I laughed out loud funny, and then I was like, wow. That was a fascinating dialogue. It was about wrestling.
Yeah.
I was blown away by that section as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's podcasts are cool. I mean, I find myself anytime I've got any time, I don't ever listen to music anymore hardly. I used to listen in my knife shop when I was a custom maker to a ton of sports talk radio.
Yep.
That was pretty much everything all I ever listened to. But that was really before podcasts, or at least before they were kind of mainstream. And now, I mean, I'm so busy now, I actually struggle to keep up on like the ones that I like. So like tonight, I'm actually heading out to Eastern Montana to go duck hunting.
Perfect.
And I'm actually looking forward to the drive.
Yeah.
Through a bunch of area with no cell service that I can just listen to some podcasts.
That's what I loved about all my flights. Mm-hmm. And I'm the same. Like, I don't have enough time, as I say, to listen to all the authors of life that are out there now, because everyone has the opportunity. Now, there's some garbage, and we all know that, but there's so many good ones.
And the thing I love about doing one, like, I don't care what the numbers end up doing on my podcast. I mean, I'm a knife maker. I run a knife company. I do this because I enjoy people like you.
I appreciate it.
And I learn things. You know, it's why I want to have you back, because, it's like there's time to, like, you got to go through someone's life and kind of learn all the path of their life. But then there's like a whole nother podcast of just talking about stuff, which is what Rogan's is so great about, right? Yep. It's like, it's just bullshitting, shooting the shit, but it goes into all these different topics. And you've been involved in so much stuff that I'm curious and interested about that, like I said, I'd love to have you back.
I appreciate that. I'd love to be back. So that's easy peasy.
How do people find you if you want them to find you?
Super easy. Everything I do is DerekWoodske.com. Just all one word. Like my ebook, I just released on trainings on there. So if someone wants to kind of see how I help people write workouts,
okay,
they can go check it out.
Yeah.
Anything I do in related to human performance will end up there one way or the other. And then of course I use the gram. It's currently set to private for the first time in its history because I've been getting botted to death.
Really?
Like, I don't even know what these bots are for, but it's a lot. So I'm just trying to figure out how to stop that.
The one thing I missed that you do was it your like daily thoughts, cup of coffee,
coffee talk.
God dang, that was some of my favorite stuff that you did back then.
I'll have to re-release that. People can go through and watch them as a series right now in the little bubbles above the Instagram.
Oh, really?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I put them all in there. But yeah, I used
to.
And they were always, my goal was always one take. If I could do it in one take, it was a success.
You need to just do some new ones here and there. God, it was a treasure trove of good stuff.
All right, I'll do it. All
right. Thanks, buddy.
You bet. Thank you.